The night they called me nobody was the same night someone decided I would never be invisible again. I used to believe expensive ballrooms had their own weather. The air always felt warmer under crystal chandeliers, the perfume smelled sweeter than anything sold in my neighborhood, and the laughter echoed like everyone inside had forgotten what it meant to worry about tomorrow. I didn't belong there. I knew it the second I adjusted the plain black server's uniform that never seemed to fit quite right and balanced a silver tray filled with sparkling water glasses. My name is Claire Morgan. I was 24 years old, working 2 jobs while taking online business classes 1 course at a time, hoping that someday I could give my 12-year-old brother, Liam, a life where overdue bills weren't stacked beside the microwave like unwanted decorations. Tonight's charity gala at the Blackwood Foundation was supposed to be simple. Smile. Serve drinks. Stay invisible. Collect my paycheck. Go home before midnight so Liam wouldn't wake up alone. That plan lasted exactly 23 minutes. Miss, you're blocking the view. A woman wrapped in diamonds waved her hand without even looking at me. I stepped aside immediately and apologized, though I hadn't been blocking anyone. Some people just don't know where they belong, another guest whispered loudly enough for me to hear. They laughed together before returning to a conversation about vacation homes and private islands. I lowered my eyes and kept walking because rent couldn't be paid with pride. The ballroom shimmered with polished marble floors and towering white floral arrangements that probably cost more than my car. Every table carried gold place cards with names I recognized from magazine covers. CEOs. Athletes. Politicians. Billionaires. They all looked comfortable here. I felt like someone who had wandered into the wrong movie. Claire. My manager's sharp voice cut through the music. Table 7 needs fresh glasses. And try not to linger. These guests expect perfection. Yes, sir. I lifted another tray and crossed the room carefully, counting every step the way I always did when I was nervous. One mistake could cost me this job, and I couldn't afford another setback. As I reached the center of the ballroom, I noticed something unusual. Nearly every conversation subtly shifted toward the grand staircase overlooking the hall. Heads turned. Smiles straightened. Even the photographers adjusted their cameras. Someone important had arrived. I didn't look right away. Important people rarely noticed women carrying trays. But curiosity won. I glanced toward the staircase just as a tall man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit descended with calm, measured confidence. He wasn't smiling. He didn't need to. The room seemed to rearrange itself around him without anyone saying a word. I recognized him instantly from business magazines sitting in grocery store checkout lines. Ethan Blackwood. America's youngest self-made billionaire. Founder. Investor. Philanthropist. The man people described as brilliant, impossible to impress, and almost never seen at public events. I expected him to acknowledge investors or shake hands with board members. Instead, while everyone else watched him, his eyes moved across the ballroom until they stopped on someone carrying a silver tray. Me. I quickly looked away, convinced I had imagined it. Men like Ethan Blackwood didn't notice women like Claire Morgan. But for reasons I couldn't explain, I suddenly felt as though the night had quietly changed direction, and somewhere beyond the music and polite applause, destiny had already taken its first step toward me. I told myself I had imagined it because people like Ethan Blackwood did not spend their evenings watching waitresses carry water glasses across crowded ballrooms. I focused on my breathing instead. One tray. One table. One smile. That was all I needed to survive another shift. The string quartet filled the room with soft music while conversations floated through the air about stock markets, luxury resorts, and investment opportunities that sounded more like another language than English to someone who measured every grocery trip down to the last dollar. I stopped beside table 7 and carefully replaced empty glasses with fresh ones. "Thank you," an older gentleman said with a warm smile that surprised me. Before I could answer, another guest leaned back in his chair and looked at my name tag. "Claire," he read aloud. You seem too quiet for hospitality. You should smile more. People pay a lot of money to enjoy themselves here. I forced another polite smile because arguing had never paid my electric bill. I hope you enjoy your evening, sir. As I turned away, one of the crystal flutes sitting near the edge of my tray began to slide. Time seemed to slow. I reached for it instinctively before it could fall, catching the glass only inches above the marble floor. A small sigh escaped my lips. Disaster avoided. Unfortunately, the movement caused a folded white envelope resting on the corner of the table to drift onto the floor without anyone noticing except me. I bent down immediately and picked it up. The thick cream paper felt expensive, and the elegant handwriting across the front read simply, Blackwood Foundation Scholarship Fund. Without thinking, I hurried toward the stage where several members of the foundation staff were organizing donation records. A woman wearing a blue blazer looked relieved when I handed her the envelope. "Oh goodness, we have been looking everywhere for this," she said. "These scholarship commitments are supposed to be announced tonight." "I found it under one of the tables," I answered. "I thought someone might need it." "Thank you," she said sincerely. "You probably just saved us from a very embarrassing mistake." I smiled, nodded, and quietly returned to work. I did not notice the pair of steady green eyes following the entire exchange from across the ballroom. Ethan had not spoken a single word since arriving, but one of his executive assistants leaned closer. "Sir, the board is waiting for your remarks." Ethan remained silent for another moment. "Who is she?" he finally asked. His assistant looked confused. "The server who returned the scholarship envelope instead of pretending she never saw it." The assistant glanced around until she spotted me carrying another tray toward the opposite side of the ballroom. "I will find out." Ethan shook his head. "No. Just observe." I knew none of this. I was too busy calculating whether I could stop by the grocery store before it closed so Liam would have enough cereal before school tomorrow morning. As I passed another table, I overheard a little girl tugging gently on her mother's sleeve. "Mom, I spilled my juice." The expensive white tablecloth carried a bright red stain. The mother looked embarrassed while nearby guests frowned. I quietly placed a fresh linen napkin beside the child and knelt just long enough to whisper, "Accidents happen to everyone. Do not worry." The little girl smiled with visible relief. When I stood again, my eyes accidentally met Ethan's for the second time that evening. This time he did not look away. Neither did I, at least not until someone called my name from across the ballroom, completely unaware that a single ordinary act of kindness had just become the most interesting part of a billionaire's night. The moment our eyes met, I looked away first because I had spent my entire life learning that people with power rarely looked at people like me for good reasons. I reminded myself that I was simply another server in a crowded ballroom, another face that would disappear before the last limousine left the curb. My manager hurried toward me with quick steps and an expression that meant trouble. "Claire, the Whitmore table wants fresh coffee immediately, and do not keep them waiting." "Of course." I nodded, collected the polished silver coffee service, and crossed the ballroom once again. The laughter grew louder as I approached the table. 5 elegantly dressed guests were discussing business deals that sounded larger than entire neighborhoods where I had grown up. Before I could pour the first cup, one woman looked me up and down with a smile that never reached her eyes. "You are the same waitress from earlier, are you not?" "Yes, ma'am." "You seem very determined." Another guest chuckled. "That is what people say when they mean desperate." The group laughed politely. I kept pouring coffee with steady hands even though I felt the warmth rising into my face. One gentleman accepted his cup without looking at me. "Tell me," he said casually, "do you ever wonder what it feels like to attend one of these events instead of serving at them?" I answered honestly before fear could stop me. "Sometimes. But tonight I am grateful to have honest work." The table fell silent for a heartbeat before another woman shrugged. "That is a surprisingly ambitious answer." "Ambitious?" someone repeated with a grin. "She should be realistic. People are born into different worlds for a reason." I smiled politely because I had learned long ago that silence often protected dignity better than arguments. My mother used to tell me that kindness cost nothing, even when people acted as though it had no value. I carried those words with me every single day after she passed away. As I lifted the empty coffee pot, I noticed one of the elderly guests struggling to reach the cane leaning against his chair. Before anyone else reacted, I quietly stepped forward, picked it up, and placed it gently into his waiting hand. "Thank you, young lady," he said with genuine appreciation. "You noticed before anyone else did. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, sir." His warm smile remained long after I walked away, but the others barely acknowledged what had happened. To them I was still part of the furniture, useful only when needed and forgotten the moment I stepped aside. Across the ballroom, Ethan Blackwood had witnessed every second. He did not interrupt the conversation surrounding him, yet his attention never drifted from the woman everyone else overlooked. One board member leaned toward him. "The donors are ready whenever you are." Ethan continued watching quietly. "Interesting," he murmured. "What is?" the board member asked. Ethan's eyes remained fixed across the room. "Everyone keeps telling her what she is worth." He paused, his expression impossible to read. "Not one of them has asked who she actually is." I knew nothing about that conversation. I only knew that my shift still had hours to go and that Liam would probably leave the porch light on until I came home. As I carried another tray toward the kitchen entrance, I heard someone behind me whisper just loudly enough to reach my ears. "She is nobody." The words should not have hurt. I had heard versions of them my entire life. Yet for reasons I could not explain, something inside me quietly refused to believe them anymore. The words followed me all the way to the service hallway. "She is nobody." I repeated them silently as I stacked clean glasses onto another silver tray, trying to convince myself they were only sounds floating through a crowded room. If I carried every cruel sentence people had ever thrown at me, I would never have enough strength left to carry anything else. I took one slow breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked back into the ballroom. The evening program was about to begin. Guests gradually found their seats while waitstaff moved quietly between tables, refilling water glasses and collecting empty plates before the foundation chairman introduced the Knight Scholarship Initiative. I stopped beside a table near the front when a sharp voice interrupted me. "Excuse me." I turned immediately. The same elegantly dressed woman from earlier was studying my uniform with visible annoyance. "This water is not cold anymore." I apologized and reached for the glass. As I did, another guest smirked. "You cannot expect excellence from someone who probably has never attended an event like this." Several people around the table smiled politely without disagreeing. I felt every pair of eyes settle on me. My cheeks warmed, but I kept my voice calm. "I will replace it right away, ma'am." "Perhaps she should learn the difference between serving successful people and pretending to belong beside them," another man added. Quiet laughter spread around the table. My fingers tightened around the tray, but I refused to let my hands shake. My mother had always said that dignity was something no one could hand me and no one could take away unless I surrendered it myself. I lowered my eyes, prepared to walk away, when an unfamiliar silence settled across the ballroom. It happened so gradually that even the musicians slowed before finishing the final note. I looked up instinctively. Ethan Blackwood had risen from his chair. He did not raise his voice. He did not appear angry. He simply walked toward our table with the same measured confidence he had carried since entering the ballroom. Conversations faded as guests watched him approach. Even my manager stopped moving. Ethan glanced briefly at the untouched glass in my hand before looking at the guests seated around the table. "Is there a problem?" he asked. The woman smiled nervously. "Nothing important. We were only discussing service standards." Ethan nodded once. "I see." His eyes moved toward me for only a second before returning to the table. "Has this employee been disrespectful?" "No," the woman admitted. "Has she refused a request?" "No." "Has she failed to do her job?" Another uncomfortable pause followed. No. Ethan folded his hands calmly in front of him. Then perhaps the conversation should reflect the standards this foundation was built to represent. No one answered. His voice remained steady, almost gentle. Every person working in this room deserves the same respect as every person attending it. Kindness is not reserved for donors. It is expected from them. The silence that followed felt heavier than any applause could have been. The guests quietly lowered their eyes. One gentleman cleared his throat before looking at me. "Miss Morgan, I owe you an apology." The woman beside him nodded awkwardly. "So do I." I stood frozen, uncertain whether I had actually heard those words. Ethan simply gave a small nod, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Then he turned toward the stage to begin the evening's program. Before he walked away completely, he paused beside me just long enough to say something only I could hear. "Do not let strangers decide your value." Then he continued forward, leaving an entire ballroom staring at me in stunned silence while I struggled to remember how to breathe. For several long seconds I could not move. The room that had felt so enormous only moments earlier suddenly became impossibly quiet. People who had ignored me all evening now avoided my eyes, while others looked at me with curiosity instead of dismissal. None of it felt real. I lowered my head slightly and whispered, "Thank you." Ethan acknowledged my words with the smallest nod before continuing toward the stage where the foundation board was waiting. The applause that welcomed him sounded almost distant to me because my heartbeat had become louder than anything else in the ballroom. I carried my tray back toward the service station, hoping to disappear before anyone else noticed me. "Claire." My manager hurried after me with wide eyes. "Are you all right?" "Yes. I have worked these events for 12 years, he said quietly. I have never seen Mr. Blackwood interrupt a conversation to defend someone. I forced a small smile. Neither have I. He looked as though he wanted to ask more questions, but another employee called his name, and he rushed away. I stood alone for a moment beside the polished silver coffee urns, trying to steady my breathing. Then I heard footsteps approaching behind me. I turned and saw Ethan Blackwood walking through the service corridor without security, without photographers, without the crowd that always seemed to surround him. He stopped several feet away, giving me more space than I expected. "Miss Morgan." His voice was calm, almost conversational. "I hope the rest of your evening is easier." "It already is because of what you did." I hesitated before adding, "Thank you for standing up for me." "No one should have to earn basic respect," he answered. There was no pride in his voice, only certainty. "May I ask you something?" I nodded. "Why did you return the scholarship envelope?" The question caught me by surprise. "Because it did not belong to me. Many people would have ignored it." I smiled faintly. "Maybe. But those scholarships belong to students who need them. I know what it feels like to hope someone gives you a chance." He studied me quietly. "You speak as though you have been waiting for one." "I have," I admitted. "But I have learned that opportunities mean more when you earn them." For the first time that evening, the corner of his mouth lifted into the hint of a smile. "That is a rare answer." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a simple white business card with nothing except his name, a direct office number, and the Blackwood logo embossed across the front. He held it toward me. I looked at the card but made no move to take it. "If this is because you feel sorry for me," I said carefully, "I cannot accept it." His expression remained unchanged, although I noticed genuine surprise in his eyes. "You believe this is charity?" "I believe people sometimes confuse gratitude with obligation," I replied softly. "You defended me because it was the right thing to do. That does not mean you owe me anything, and it does not mean I should accept something I have not earned." The silence between us felt comfortable rather than awkward. Finally, Ethan slipped the card back into his pocket instead of insisting. "You may be the first person who has ever refused my help before knowing what it was." I smiled for the first time all night. Maybe because I would rather be remembered for my work than for accepting favors. His eyes held mine for another quiet moment before he nodded with unmistakable respect. "Then I hope our paths cross again under different circumstances, Miss Morgan." As he walked back toward the ballroom, I watched him disappear beneath the glow of the chandeliers, completely unaware that saying no to the most powerful man in the room had just made him more determined than ever to learn who Claire Morgan really was. My shift finally ended a little after 11:30. The ballroom that had glittered with conversation only hours earlier now echoed with the quiet sounds of staff folding linens and stacking chairs. I changed out of my uniform, slipped on my worn denim jacket, and stepped into the cool Manhattan night. The city smelled like rain even though the sidewalks were dry. I checked my phone as I walked toward the subway station. One message waited from Liam. It read, "Good night, Claire." I left the porch light on. "Do not worry." I smiled despite the exhaustion pulling at every step. Home was a small two-bedroom apartment in Queens with squeaky floors, faded kitchen cabinets, and a refrigerator that hummed louder than the television. It was not much, but it was ours. I stopped at the neighborhood grocery store before closing and spent $18.43 on cereal, milk, eggs, bread, and Liam's favorite apples because they happened to be on sale. Every dollar mattered. Every receipt stayed folded inside my wallet until payday. By the time I unlocked our apartment door, the porch light still glowed through the front window exactly as Liam had promised. He had fallen asleep on the couch with an open science book resting across his chest. I covered him with a blanket before quietly finishing the dishes that had been left in the sink. Tomorrow morning would arrive too quickly for either of us. Across the city, the lights were still on inside Ethan Blackwood's office overlooking the skyline. The charity gala had officially ended, yet he had not gone home. A leather folder rested on his desk beside the untouched cup of coffee that had gone cold more than an hour earlier. His executive assistant entered after a gentle knock. "You asked me to look into Claire Morgan." Ethan nodded once but did not interrupt. "There is very little public information," she said. "She works part-time for Sterling Event Services. She also has a morning position at a neighborhood bookstore 3 days each week. No criminal record. No debt outside ordinary student loans. She is the legal guardian of her younger brother after both parents passed away several years ago." Ethan remained silent, encouraging her to continue. "Neighbors describe her as dependable. Teachers at the local middle school say she volunteers during weekend reading programs. According to the bookstore owner, she often purchases children's books with her employee discount and quietly leaves them at the community center without telling anyone." Ethan leaned back slowly. "Has she ever requested assistance from the foundation?" "Never." "Applied for grants?" "No." His assistant hesitated before adding one last detail. "There is something unusual. 3 different people mentioned that whenever someone tries to thank her for helping, she always says the same thing." Ethan finally looked up. "What does she say?" "She tells them that everyone deserves one person who believes in them. She simply hopes to be that person whenever she can." The room became quiet again. Ethan walked toward the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking thousands of glowing apartment windows stretching across the city. Somewhere among them was a woman who had refused his business card, returned money that was never hers, accepted humiliation without surrendering her kindness, and spent her evenings caring for a younger brother instead of chasing recognition. He had spent years surrounded by people eager to impress him, yet the one person who held his attention had asked for absolutely nothing. He looked back toward the folder on his desk but made no move to open it again. "No more investigations," he said calmly. His assistant looked surprised. "Sir? If I want to know who Claire Morgan really is, I will learn it from her, not from a file." The next morning began the way most mornings did, with the sound of the coffee maker struggling louder than the alarm clock. I packed Liam's lunch while he searched for a missing homework folder that had somehow slipped beneath the living room couch. We laughed when we found it, and for a few minutes life felt wonderfully ordinary. After dropping him off at school, I caught the subway downtown for my shift at the bookstore. The little shop sat on a quiet corner between a bakery and a tailor, and although the shelves were worn and the carpet had faded years ago, it had always felt like the safest place in the city. Mrs. Harper, the owner, greeted me with her usual smile. "Good morning, Claire. We received a donation of children's books yesterday." "That is wonderful," I replied as I began arranging a display near the front window. "The community center will be happy." She nodded knowingly. "I had a feeling you would say that." By lunchtime the store welcomed its usual mix of students, retirees, and parents searching for affordable books. Just before noon, a young mother entered holding the hand of a little boy who could not have been older than 7. He wandered toward the adventure section while she quietly counted the bills inside her wallet. When she reached the register, her smile faded. She gently set one book aside. "I am sorry, sweetheart," she whispered to her son. "We can only afford one today." The little boy nodded bravely, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes as he looked back at the second book. I pretended to straighten a nearby shelf until they walked outside. Then I quietly purchased the second book with my employee discount and hurried after them. "Excuse me," I called softly. The mother turned with surprise. I handed the book to her son. "Someone already paid for this." She looked confused. "Who?" I smiled. "Someone who believes every child deserves another story." Before she could ask another question, I wished them a wonderful day and returned to the bookstore. I never noticed the dark sedan parked across the street. Ethan had not planned to stop there. A meeting nearby had ended earlier than expected, and his driver had taken a different route because of traffic. Through the passenger window he happened to see Claire leaving the bookstore with a single wrapped book in her hands. He watched as she gave it away without expecting recognition, photographs, or thanks. "Pull over," he said quietly. His driver did as instructed. Ethan remained inside the car, observing from a respectful distance. He saw the little boy hug the book tightly against his chest while his mother wiped away grateful tears. Claire simply waved and disappeared back inside the bookstore as though nothing remarkable had happened. Ethan sat in thoughtful silence. "Sir," his driver finally asked, "would you like me to introduce you?" Ethan slowly shook his head. "No." "Then shall we continue to your office?" Ethan looked once more through the bookstore window where Claire was helping an elderly customer reach a novel on the highest shelf. "Not yet." He realized something that surprised even him. For years he had built companies by studying numbers, contracts, and opportunities. Yet the woman quietly shelving books across the street had become the most compelling investment of his attention because every time the world gave her a chance to choose herself first, she somehow chose kindness instead, and the more he witnessed it, the less he believed such a heart could remain unnoticed forever. Life has a quiet way of testing people just when they begin to believe things might finally be getting better. 3 days after the charity gala, my phone rang while I was organizing a shipment of new arrivals at the bookstore. The caller identification displayed the name of Liam's middle school. My stomach tightened before I even answered. The school counselor spoke gently, explaining that Liam had become dizzy during gym class. He was awake and smiling, she assured me, but they wanted me to pick him up and have him examined by his pediatrician. I thanked her, left work early with Mrs. Harper's blessing, and hurried across the city. By late afternoon we sat inside our neighborhood medical clinic. Liam insisted he felt fine, joking about missing a math quiz, but the doctor recommended additional tests to rule out anything serious. Most of the results looked normal. One did not. The physician spoke carefully, choosing every word with kindness. A specialist would need to evaluate Liam within the next few weeks. It was not an emergency, but delaying the appointment would not be wise either. I nodded calmly while taking notes, asking practical questions, pretending my hands were not trembling inside my jacket pockets. On the subway ride home, Liam leaned against my shoulder and fell asleep. I stared at the reflection in the dark window, mentally calculating insurance deductibles, transportation costs, unpaid hours away from work, and rent due in 12 days. Numbers had never frightened me before. That evening they did. After Liam went to bed, I spread every bill across our small kitchen table. I crossed out expenses we could postpone. I canceled the streaming subscription we barely used. I skipped replacing my worn winter boots even though the soles had started separating from the leather. I promised myself that somehow I would make everything work. The next morning I arrived at the bookstore early, determined not to let worry follow me through the day. Mrs. Harper noticed the tired circles beneath my eyes almost immediately. "Claire, are you certain you are all right?" I smiled because smiling had become easier than explaining. "Just a busy week." She squeezed my hand gently before returning to the office. Across town, Ethan sat through a quarterly board meeting without hearing half the conversation. His phone vibrated quietly beneath the conference table. A message from his assistant appeared on the screen. She had not ignored his instruction to stop investigating Claire. Instead, she had simply forwarded a public notice from the community center. Claire had canceled her usual weekend reading program because of a family medical appointment. Nothing more. Nothing private. Ethan read the message twice before slipping the phone back into his pocket. For reasons he could not fully explain, the cancellation unsettled him. The woman who always seemed to show up for everyone else had suddenly stepped away from something she loved. When the meeting ended, one executive asked whether he wished to approve the final expansion proposal. Ethan looked toward the city skyline outside the conference room window. "Reschedule the afternoon," he said quietly. "I have somewhere else I need to be." He did not yet know where that would lead him. He only knew that somewhere in the same city, Claire Morgan was carrying another burden alone, and for the first time in many years, walking away from a business meeting felt less important than discovering whether the strongest woman he had ever met was finally running out of reasons to keep smiling. The specialist's office was nearly an hour away, and every mile felt longer than the last. Liam sat beside me on the bus with his headphones on, staring out the window as neighborhoods drifted past in a blur of brick buildings and autumn trees. He kept pretending everything was normal, asking whether we could stop for pizza afterward if the appointment went well. I smiled and promised we would, even though I quietly counted the few bills folded inside my wallet. The examination lasted less than 40 minutes. The doctor spoke with reassuring patience, explaining that Liam's condition appeared manageable, but additional testing and follow-up visits would be important over the coming months. Relief washed over me for one brief moment before the financial coordinator handed me a printed estimate for the portion not covered by insurance. My chest tightened. The amount was more than I earned in several weeks. I thanked her politely, folded the paper, and slipped it into my purse before Liam could read it. He deserved hope, not numbers. Outside the clinic the afternoon sky had turned gray, and a cold breeze carried the promise of rain. Liam looked up at me with the same trusting smile he had worn since he was little. "Everything is going to be okay, right?" I knelt so our eyes were level. "It is," I answered honestly. "We will figure it out together." He believed me immediately. Children have a remarkable way of trusting the people who love them most. After dropping him back at school for the remainder of the afternoon, I headed straight to my second job at the bookstore. Mrs. Harper noticed the strain in my face before I even reached the register. "Claire, you should take the evening off." I shook my head gently. "I cannot. Not today." She did not argue. She simply hugged me for a brief second before returning to help another customer. As the afternoon passed, I found myself smiling for customers the same way I always had, even though my thoughts never left the folded estimate resting inside my purse. Shortly before closing time, the front door chimed softly. I looked up automatically and froze. Ethan Blackwood stepped inside wearing a simple navy coat instead of an expensive suit. Without a crowd surrounding him, he looked surprisingly ordinary, though there was nothing ordinary about the quiet confidence he carried. Several customers recognized him immediately, whispering to one another, but he acknowledged no one except the elderly woman browsing the history section, whom he politely allowed to pass before approaching the register. "Good afternoon, Miss Morgan," he said warmly. I blinked in surprise. "Mr. Blackwood. I did not expect to see you here." "Neither did I," he admitted with a faint smile. I was looking for a gift for my niece, and someone recommended this bookstore. I could not tell whether that was true, but something about his calm expression made it difficult to doubt him. I helped him choose a classic adventure novel, wrapped it carefully, and handed him the small paper bag. He reached for his wallet, then paused. His eyes settled briefly on the medical estimate that had slipped halfway from my purse while I reached for the receipt book. He did not read it. He simply noticed the hospital logo before respectfully looking away. "You look tired," he said quietly. I laughed softly. "That is because I am." He studied my face for one thoughtful moment before speaking again. "If life is asking too much of you right now, you do not have to carry everything alone." I smiled with gratitude, but I gently shook my head. "Thank you. Truly. But some journeys belong to family, and I have never been afraid of hard work." Ethan nodded slowly, as though he had expected that answer all along. He accepted the wrapped book, wished me a good evening, and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he glanced back once, his expression filled not with pity but with quiet admiration, and in that silent moment I realized something had changed. He was no longer seeing the waitress from the gala or the clerk inside a neighborhood bookstore. He was seeing me. The following week reminded me that kindness has a strange way of returning when you least expect it, although rarely in the form you imagine. I continued working every available shift, picked up extra hours at the bookstore, and spent my evenings helping Liam with homework while pretending the growing folder of medical paperwork did not keep me awake after midnight. I never told him how worried I was. Children deserve bedtime stories, not adult fears. Friday evening brought another catering event, this time at a downtown business awards banquet. As I pinned on my name tag, I realized several familiar faces from the charity gala were already gathering inside the ballroom. For one brief second I wondered whether any of them would even remember me. The answer arrived faster than I expected. The same gentleman who had apologized after Ethan defended me approached before the reception even began. "Miss Morgan," he said with genuine warmth, "it is good to see you again." I smiled politely. "Thank you, sir. Welcome back." He accepted a glass of sparkling water before lowering his voice. "I have thought about our last conversation more than once. I judged someone without knowing anything about her. I wanted you to know I regret that." His words surprised me more than I cared to admit. "I appreciate you saying that." Before I could continue serving, another familiar guest stepped forward. She was the elegantly dressed woman who had once questioned whether I belonged in the room. This time her expression carried none of the confidence I remembered. "Claire," she began carefully, "I owe you another apology. I have a daughter about your age." After the gala she asked why I spoke to you the way I did. I did not have a good answer. I looked at her for a long moment before smiling gently. "Thank you for telling me." Her shoulders relaxed with visible relief. "You are far more gracious than I deserved." As the evening continued, something remarkable happened. People greeted me by name instead of snapping their fingers for service. They thanked me for refilling glasses. They smiled instead of looking through me. Nothing about my uniform had changed, yet somehow the way they saw the person wearing it had. Across the ballroom, another guest quietly observed every interaction without interrupting. Ethan had arrived only minutes earlier for an award presentation, but it did not take long for him to notice the subtle difference in the room. His executive assistant leaned toward him. Word traveled after the foundation gala. "Several donors contacted us afterward to compliment the way you handled the situation." Ethan watched as one elderly couple thanked me for helping them find their table. "It was never about compliments," he answered. "No, sir." She smiled knowingly. "It was about changing the example." Ethan nodded almost imperceptibly. Examples matter. Later that evening, as guests prepared to leave, the banquet organizer approached me carrying a sealed envelope. "This was left for you." I frowned. "Who left it?" "The gentleman has already gone." Inside was a handwritten note that simply read, "Thank you for reminding us that character is not measured by income." Enclosed was a generous gift card to the bookstore where I worked. There was no signature. No way to return it. No public recognition. Only kindness quietly offered. I looked across the ballroom instinctively. Ethan was standing near the exit speaking with several executives. He never looked in my direction, never claimed credit, never suggested the gift had anything to do with him. Yet as he walked out into the cool New York evening, I found myself wondering whether real influence had less to do with wealth than with the quiet courage to change how people treated someone the world had once overlooked. 2 weeks later, life settled into a rhythm that looked peaceful from the outside but felt anything but simple. Liam's follow-up appointment was approaching, my savings account continued shrinking, and every extra shift I accepted seemed to disappear into another envelope marked rent, groceries, transportation, or medical expenses. Still, every morning I reminded myself that hope was not something you found. It was something you practiced. One rainy Saturday afternoon, I arrived early at the community center to help with the children's reading program. The room buzzed with excited voices as little hands reached for colorful books scattered across folding tables. Watching children fall in love with stories always reminded me that imagination could make even the smallest room feel limitless. Halfway through the afternoon, Mrs. Delgado, the program director, walked toward me carrying an envelope with my name written neatly across the front. "This came by courier this morning," she said. "I thought it might be something for the program." I thanked her and slipped it into my bag without opening it. The children deserved my full attention first. We spent the next 2 hours reading adventure stories, drawing pictures, and laughing at dramatic pirate voices that were far more entertaining than accurate. By the time the last family left, rain tapped gently against the windows, and the room felt unusually quiet. I finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten note. There was no signature. No company logo. Only one sentence written in careful black ink. "Never stop believing that quiet kindness changes loud worlds." Folded behind the note was a check made payable directly to the children's reading program for enough money to replace every damaged book on the shelves. I stared at it in disbelief. Mrs. Delgado looked over my shoulder and covered her mouth with both hands. "Claire," she whispered, "this could keep the program running for another year." I searched the envelope again, hoping to find some clue about the donor, but there was nothing. Later that evening, as I locked the center's front door, I noticed a familiar dark sedan parked across the street. The rear passenger window lowered slowly. Ethan stepped out holding a black umbrella against the steady rain. He walked toward me with the same calm confidence I had come to recognize, yet somehow he seemed more relaxed than the billionaire I had first met beneath crystal chandeliers. "Good evening, Miss Morgan." I smiled. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood." He glanced toward the brightly colored drawings still taped inside the community center windows. The children looked happy. They always do when someone believes they matter. Our eyes met for a quiet moment. I hesitated before asking the question that had lingered in my thoughts all afternoon. "Was it you?" He tilted his head slightly. "Was what me?" I held up the envelope. "The donation." Ethan smiled, but there was something almost amused in the expression. Would knowing the answer change how many books those children receive? I looked down at the envelope before slowly shaking my head. "No." "Then perhaps the answer is not the most important part." He paused as the rain softened around us. "Sometimes kindness works best when no one is keeping score." I laughed quietly. "That sounds like something my mother used to say." Ethan's expression softened. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." My smile faded into something more thoughtful. "She was." We stood together beneath the rain for another moment before he spoke again. "Claire, I owe you the truth about something." My heartbeat quickened as he looked directly into my eyes. "The night we met at the gala was not the first time I noticed you." I simply did not realize it until much later. The rain continued falling in soft silver lines between us, but suddenly I was no longer thinking about the weather. I was thinking about the way Ethan had said those words, not as someone trying to impress me, but as someone finally ready to stop hiding the truth. I searched his face for an explanation. "What do you mean?" I asked quietly. Ethan glanced toward the glowing windows of the community center before answering. "About a year ago, I visited one of our literacy partnerships without telling anyone who I was. I wanted to see whether the programs we funded actually changed lives." I frowned, trying to remember. "I was there almost every Saturday." He nodded. "I know." My heart skipped. There was a little girl who refused to read aloud because she believed she was not smart enough. Every volunteer tried to encourage her, but nothing worked. I remembered her immediately. Emily. 7 years old. Bright eyes. Shy smile. "You sat beside her for nearly an hour," Ethan continued. "You did not correct her. You did not rush her. You simply read one sentence, then let her read the next. By the end of the afternoon she finished an entire chapter by herself." A memory slowly returned. I had noticed a man standing near the back of the room that day, dressed so simply that I assumed he was another volunteer's family member. I had smiled politely before returning my attention to the children. "That was you," I whispered. Ethan smiled. "You never asked who I was. You never tried to impress me. You barely noticed me." I laughed softly. "I was busy." "Exactly." His eyes never left mine. "Everyone else wanted something from me. You wanted something for someone else." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The steady rhythm of the rain filled the silence. Finally I looked down at the envelope still resting in my hands. "Why did you never tell me?" He considered the question carefully. "Because if I had introduced myself that day, I would never have known whether your kindness belonged to the children or to my last name." I felt my eyes sting unexpectedly. "You have been watching me ever since?" "Not watching," he answered gently. "Remembering." He stepped a little closer, still leaving enough space that I never felt uncomfortable. "Claire, I have negotiated billion-dollar agreements. I have spent years learning how to recognize value before anyone else could see it. But you taught me something none of those experiences ever did." I looked up at him. "What is that?" His voice became almost a whisper. "The rarest thing in the world is not success. It is a good heart that stays good after life has given it every reason to become bitter." I could not find words. No expensive gift, no grand gesture, no public speech could have reached me the way that sentence did. He was not praising what I owned. He was honoring who I had chosen to become. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and removed the same simple business card I had refused weeks earlier at the charity gala. He smiled before holding it between two fingers. "I kept this because I hoped someday I could offer it again for the right reason." He tore the card cleanly in half and slipped the pieces back into his pocket. I looked at him with surprise. "You destroyed it." "I did." His smile grew warmer than I had ever seen before. "I do not want you to call an office anymore. I would rather you call me." Then, for the first time since our lives had unexpectedly crossed, Ethan Blackwood stopped speaking like a billionaire addressing a stranger and simply spoke like a man who had finally found someone worth opening his heart to. "Claire, would you allow me to get to know you, not because you need saving, but because meeting you has quietly changed the person I want to become?" For the first time in a very long while, I did not answer immediately because some moments deserve silence before they deserve words. The rain had almost stopped, leaving tiny drops clinging to the streetlights until the whole sidewalk shimmered like scattered stars. I looked at Ethan and realized that nothing about this journey had happened the way people usually imagine stories like ours. He had never tried to rescue me from my life. He had simply respected it. That difference meant everything. I smiled before finally speaking. "Yes. I would like that." His expression softened with a quiet happiness that no newspaper photograph had ever captured. There was no dramatic celebration. No cameras. No crowd. Just two people standing outside a neighborhood community center while the city continued rushing around them, completely unaware that two lives had just begun moving in the same direction. The months that followed changed us both in ways neither of us expected. Ethan never attempted to solve every problem with money. Instead, he showed up. He attended Liam's follow-up appointments whenever his schedule allowed, sitting beside us in ordinary waiting rooms without asking for special treatment. He visited the bookstore, buying novels he often admitted he already owned simply because he enjoyed talking with Mrs. Harper about classic literature. On Saturday mornings he volunteered at the reading program, sitting cross-legged on the carpet while children proudly sounded out difficult words one sentence at a time. They had no idea they were reading to one of the wealthiest men in America. To them, he was simply Mr. Ethan. Liam grew healthier with every passing month, and one afternoon he pulled me aside while Ethan helped stack folding chairs after the reading program. "He makes you smile differently," my little brother whispered. I laughed through unexpected tears. "Is that a good thing?" Liam grinned. "It is my favorite thing." Nearly a year after the gala where our paths first crossed, the Blackwood Foundation hosted another charity evening. This time I was not carrying a silver tray. I was invited as the director of an expanded literacy initiative serving children across several neighborhoods, a program made possible by hundreds of generous donors and volunteers working together. As I stepped into the ballroom, I remembered how invisible I had once felt beneath those same crystal chandeliers. Before I could lose myself in the memory, Ethan reached for my hand. Not to display me. Not to rescue me. Simply to walk beside me. During his closing remarks, he looked across the room before finding my eyes. "The greatest investment I have ever made was never a company," he said calmly. "It was learning that the strongest foundations are built by people whose character remains unchanged even when no one is watching." The applause that followed belonged to everyone who had helped build the program, but when he returned to my side, he quietly slipped a small velvet box into my hands. Inside rested a simple ring that reflected the light without trying to compete with it. "Claire Morgan," he said softly, "you never asked me for anything. That is exactly why I want to spend the rest of my life giving you my time, my trust, and my heart. Will you marry me?" Tears blurred the room into soft circles of light as I answered the easiest question I had ever been asked. Yes. Years later, people often assumed I had fallen in love with a billionaire. They were only half right. I fell in love with a man who looked beyond uniforms, beyond bank accounts, beyond first impressions, and saw a future where others had only seen a stranger. The world once decided I was invisible before learning my name. He simply decided to learn my name first. And sometimes the most extraordinary love stories do not begin when someone changes your life. They begin when someone quietly reminds you that your life already had value all along.